Howdy, everybody. My name is Robert Early. I am a sophomore psychology and anthropology major and a member of the company A2 in the Corps of Cadets. And today, I'll be discussing how every single one of you can be a citizen scientist and how I was a citizen scientist through my findings and the impact of the species behavior by our presence in Antarctica. And this journey started about 15 years ago when my mom and my gran and I watched National Geographic's March of the Emperor Penguin so many times that the VHS stopped working, which, for those of you who don't know what a VHS is, that's a lot of times. And what they did in that moment that really captured and promoted my sense of discovery and learning for the rest of my life is every time I had a question, no matter how dumb or small or large, they did their best to answer me or find a way in which I could get the answer. And if they hadn't done that then my passion for learning and this trip probably would have never happened. And I was not alone in this. On this trip, I spoke to 36 of the first-time people on the ship, people that had never been to Antarctica before, whether they were staff or tourists, and every single member, all 36, said one of two things, and sometimes both. They said, one, I can't believe this is real, which, understandable, it was gorgeous. It's hard to believe it's real when you're there. And two, they wish they could do more. People from all around the world, different backgrounds, different positions, every single one said, every other one said that they wish they could do something more to help. And I understand that. I felt the same way. I even felt that way 15 years ago when I watched a documentary over and over and over again. So what I did to see what we can do is I looked at how we affect the behavior of the species in Antarctica. And I had a couple questions that I looked into. You don't have to read all of them because I'll summarize them for you. I looked at the avian seabirds and I saw how our ships affected their behavior. I looked at the seals and I saw how their behavior was different when they see tourists versus when they see scientists on the sea ice on the other side of Antarctica. I looked at the crowd favorite penguins, saw how we affected them when we were around, and I also got to work with the most dangerous species in Antarctica, which we'll talk about when we get there. So, moving on with the seabirds. What I looked at here is when we look at history, especially naval history, for as long as there have been vessels and there have been seabirds have followed vessels. We don't know exactly why. I would love to give you a definitive answer, however I can't. But I did look at why potentially the seabirds in the Drake Passage in Antarctica were exhibiting this behavior when for hundreds and thousands of years they'd never seen a ship at all. So why did they mystically start doing the behavior as well? There were two main theories, and there still are two main theories, and that's one, that there's potentially some memories of previous fishing in which when the sea boats would churn up water, krill and whatnot would come to the surface, or when they would go fishing, they would chum the water, throw out their junk, and the birds eat that as well. The other theory was that they followed our ships to get a boost, to circle around the ships and use it to help with their currents and their flying. What I did was I spent typically 3 to 4 hours a day in the Drake Passage up watching the birds, and the behavior I witnessed was primarily from two species, as you can see on the board, the Antarctic petrel and the Cape petrel. Cape petrels typically came in groups of 2 to 3 birds and circled around the ship over and over again before they disappeared. They would do this anywhere from 30 minutes to a couple hours. And then the Antarctic petrels came in much larger groups, as you can see, 20 to 30 birds circling over and over and over again, which was miserable for me because I'm extremely motion sick, as you can see by the little throw up emoji. I threw up 13 times, and I'm going to blame the seabirds for it. So thank you, petrels. So what we see from this behavior is that they continuously circled, but the amount of time they actually left to eat was very little. I saw maybe 15 minutes at most of them landing, eating, and hopping back up again. So with this new behavior that we saw, and with the fact that they don't see much fishing in the Drake Passage, I'm leaning towards potentially the fact that what they're doing is using that boost, going around and around the ship. As I spoke with some of the experts from the NSF, what they told me was that when they do that, they're essentially using zero energy over and over and over again. What we're doing is we're giving them a nice, easy ride since they spend all their time out at sea, which is a little example of how not all of our effects are negative. And I thought that was very interesting. And it really promoted and made me think more of how can we continue to make more positive effects? How can we look at what we do and make it a little bit better, a little bit more positive? Which leads to our next species, the seals. Primarily elephant seals is what we looked at. And we looked at weaners, which is the juvenile age when they're being weaned off of their parents. Yes, you can chuckle at that name. Everyone on the ship did frequently. And there were the adult seals. And when I spoke with various NSF scientists, what they told me is when we look at seals on the other side, on the ice floors, or the sea ice as it was, What happens is when scientists come up to them, they do nothing. They just sit there, lay around, they burp a little bit because they're kind of gross creatures when you really look at them, and that's all they do. They just lay around. You can get as close as I am to you right now, and they wouldn't react. That was pretty true for our adults that we saw, especially the elephant seal, which this guy weighed about 2 tons. Nothing my little over 100-pound frame could do to him would really get a reaction. So there's nothing for him to worry about on this at all. He's the size of a motorcycle. It was the wieners that were the most reactive. This is where it's important. So we've got to remember, these wieners just left their mom. And for all of us that have done that in our lives, that's a pretty anxiety-inducing moment. When you go off to college, maybe you get your own house, it's not easy. And these little guys are not only just left their mom, but now they have to figure out how to live on their own lives, how to make their own harems, how to connect with others. It's a big deal. So when we come up, these things that they had never seen before walking around on their turf, they freaked out. They got really nervous. As you can see, they would kind of wave at us. They would look at us. They would engage in play fighting with each other to potentially intimidate us. And they did this because, like I said, they were nervous. And I thought this was interesting because when we look at the Antarctic policy for approach distances with seals, it's a generalized 5 to 15 meters. There's nothing specific. And I found that interesting because if we know, and especially now, that one group of these seals are being bothered particularly, why don't we have specific rules to approach them at a further distance? And while there's nothing I can do to change that now, I'd like to push forward with it because, again, I would like to make the difference, and I think you should as well. If we know these guys are getting more stressed because we're close to them, maybe we should be a little bit more avoidant and pay a little more attention to them. And with this in mind, so I got to see some good effects we had and some bad, stressful effects we had, I got to dive into the crowd favorite, penguins. We saw primarily 3 penguins, as Mary discussed. Oh, sorry, that's another crab-eater seal. So talking a little bit about the crab-eater seal here before we go into penguins. This is a little bit of an interesting encounter I'd like to share with you. And this crab-eater seal is actually injured. He got bit by an orca, so he's all bloody, nasty. And we got to go again with that approach distance of 5 meters, and it freaked him out. He was making sounds, he was looking at us, extremely bothered by our presence, but there's no rule about it, so we could do it. And of course, all the tourists want to see it. So going back to the idea of the good and the bad effect, maybe we should change that policy. If we see a guy that's hurt, we should probably leave him alone. And then going back into penguins, hopping right in with them. Penguins, which you would think as little tiny guys that came up here, taller than here, they would be extremely stressed. Most of them were not. They were very bold creatures. We saw in the behavior 2 primary differences. Behaviors they exhibited as a group, behaviors they experienced as an individual. And blowing that up so you can kind of see the differences, since we talked about, we saw 3 groups, only 2 primary colonies, Gentoo and Chinstraps. They all kind of explained or demonstrated the same behavior. So when we look at their group behavior, they completely and utterly ignored us. We were nothing to them. As you can see here with this group of Chinstraps on the left and this group of Adelies on the right, with Cece, who's making a face just like the penguins. I think that's kind of funny. We're at a distance of 5 meters, and every single one of them is ignoring us. Not a single one's looking at us. Pretty interesting, especially when it could be groups of 20 like this or 30 or more, and every single one's ignoring us. What this is called is active ignorance, and active ignorance is something that we kind of experience every single day. To give you the difference between ignorance and active ignorance is like when you're eating in a restaurant. When you're talking to someone in front of you, you're ignoring the other people around you because you're focused on one thing. You have no reason to ignore the other people, it's just happening. Active ignorance is if you're sitting by yourself in a restaurant and you actively ignore every single one other person there. They're not there, they're not real, I'm gonna focus on my food, and that's what they were doing. Some of the behaviors they displayed when they were actively ignoring us is they would do their calls, as Mary discussed. They would play fight, engage in fights, and they would also mate right in front of us, which I personally don't have the confidence to do that, but power to them. However, individuals, on the other hand, were much more stressed, considerably more stressed. And what they would do is one of 3 behaviors. The first was condensing, as we can see this chin strap on the left doing. What he's doing is he was looking at us and he's balling himself up, getting nice and warm. And while he clearly couldn't fight back or do anything, he felt more comfortable because he was more stressed. Some of the other behaviors is they would fluff themselves out, kind of make this big old noise. Or they would do this right here, where they would escape where they were and run off to a group as best as they could. They were not built for land and they fell over a lot. It was kind of embarrassing. But they did their best and they tried. And again, this goes back to this dichotomy. So we're seeing one of two things. We're seeing that we have this overall policy, this overall thing we're supposed to do, but it's not working every single time. We're seeing that it works for the groups. They're not bothered, maybe a little bit stressed, but the individuals are highly stressed, so much so that they would leave the spot they were and try and waddle themselves away, which is an impressive sight if you got to see it, because again, very bad at it. So if they are so stressed, they would get up from their own spot in their own land, in their breeding area to run away. Again, potentially what we need to look at is changing that behavior with what we're doing. Maybe when they're groups, we can get closer, and when they're individuals, we should probably stand further away, especially if we know we're causing them stress. And with that in mind, I told you at the very beginning, I got a chance to work with the most dangerous species in Antarctica, and that species is people. And I say that we're the most dangerous because we can cause an immense amount of good, like we saw with the ships. We can give them a way to spend no energy, make their lives extremely easier, or we can cause extreme stress, extreme problems. And as Mary discussed and others will see, we can cause even more things, such as our climate change and so on and so forth. And going back to what I said, I talked to the tourists and some of the staff, and they all said the same thing. I can't believe this is real, and I wish I could do more. And as I was asking them this, I wondered, these expedition guides, these staff members that have been here over and over and over again, do they still feel that way? I spoke to every expedition guide and a good portion of the staff, and every single one said yes. They said their sense of awe never goes away, and they constantly wish they could do more. One young lady's even started a program to bring underprivileged middle school and high school children to Antarctica to get that opportunity and change. That's a lot of money and a lot of time and resources for you to just decide to do all of a sudden. So something here must be impacting you, and it all culminates in one phrase that David Reed, one of the expedition guides and a former biologist, told us, is that we need to make all of our trips of consequence, meaning that every single one needs to leave an impact on every single person to want to go back and change the world around them. So how do we make our trips of consequence? By engaging in citizen science. I know what you're wondering. How do I jump into this? How do I learn more? How can I become a scientist myself? And I want you to remember one thing to be a citizen scientist. I want you to remember boogers. Now, what does that mean? I want you to time travel back. Maybe you're 3, 4, 5, or 6. Maybe you just weren't a curious child and you're 8 or 9. And one of the greatest mysteries of your life is, how do boogers get into my nose? Where do they come from? Is it a fairy? I don't know. I know that was a great question of my life, and I asked my mom and my dad. My dad gave me a very interesting answer, which I didn't understand because it was very scientific. And my mom ended up giving me a better answer, and I was blessed. And I'm sure you asked that question too. Maybe you asked your teacher, your uncle, your mom, your dad. Maybe you were too brazen and bold of a child and tugged on some stranger's pant leg and asked him, which I'm glad that you made it if you did do that. But everyone does that. And what that stems from, where that comes from, is this sense of discovery that my mom and my gran, my aunt, my dad, they all fostered into me when I was little by answering my questions. And one day, that little kid's going to be tugging on your pant legs, asking you, did you put boogers in my nose and where did they come from? And it's going to be up to you to affect and to change that. And the only way to do it is to remember boogers yourself. Take the time and learn. Put yourself out there, get on Google, do your own research. Join a citizen science program like Ford Fido, or, believe it or not, you've got Google, which has almost every answer ever. Take that time, research. And going back to what David said, citizen science can make every trip a trip of consequence, but I disagree. We should not be focusing on making every single trip a trip of consequence. Instead, we need to focus on making our lives of consequence. Thank you for your time today.